Well, it's the second day of the Nigerian Economic Summit Group, and it's been pretty wonderful discussions over there. Of course, having our business editor, Tolokwo Ogujobi, stand by to bring some of the business leaders and government agencies to talk about how to revamp the economic sector, the economy of the country. And Tolokwo, some of the issues that propped up on this first day, pretty interesting conversations from them to raising concerns about Nigeria's rising debt, well, despite fax disbursement in 1 year. Also talking about conversations about the removal of fuel subsidy, liberalization of the exchange rates, global hunger index, and most importantly, the need to bring up collaborative reforms that can change the economy. Tolokwe, what's the conversation today?
Thank you so much, Sarah. Yeah, just like you said, taking a cue from the theme of this conference, which is collaborative action for growth, competitiveness, and stability. A lot of discussions has been on behind me and other rooms around Transcorp Hilton here in Abuja. Solid discussions where issues are being addressed. And let me just go straight, because I have the Chief Executive Officer of the Nigerian Economic Summit Group seated, and I don't want to take his time, Dr. Tayo Adeloju. Thank you so much. He has a lot to deal with today, but he just gave us this time. It's good to have you join us live on TVC News.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, I think it's good to start again with this theme. Everyone says it's apt, it's apt. Why did NESJ think along that line at this time?
Well, first, this is our 30th.
Yes, that's true. Thank you.
Nigerian Economic Summit anniversary. So it allows for deep reflections, not just on what has happened in the last 1 year since the last summit, but what has happened since the first summit in 1993. And so the theme points to the three, what the trilemmas, as you call it, trilemmas of Nigeria's economic development. The pursuit of stability, the pursuit of growth, and the pursuit of competitiveness. And that's why, if you look at the reflections of the keynote by the Senior Vice President of the World Bank, Mr. Gill, yesterday, he actually took us on a journey of 4 decades of Nigerian and global economic history to point to drivers of instability. Because to solve the problem of stability, of course, you must deal with the drivers of instability. The second big conversation is the conversation on growth. Nigeria has struggled with the lack of growth significantly for the last 30 years. In 1993, we were dealing with very sluggish growth. By 1999, when we went into democratic rule, we had a chance at some years of growth, what we then called the first decade of growth. And then we moved past that decade of growth into a decade of decline, and then recession and depression, followed by what has been suppressed growth since COVID. And so today, key sectors of the economy that have the potential to absorb workforce and drive high labor intensity have remained in stagnation. And how you get those sectors back into growth is a big conversation. And as the world recovers from the global pandemic, there is then the conversations about being competitive in a world that is now back to growing. And so that's why those three things, stability, growth, and competitiveness, are part of the theme of the summit. But how do you do that? You need to mobilize the collective capacity of society, private sector, public sector, civil society, development sector, to all be singing from the same hymn sheet in terms of how to grow, what to grow, where to grow. And everyone needs to almost reach a consensus and a drum beat on where the pace of reform needs to be. And the urgency required, to solve what is a fantastically painful cost of living crisis and cost of doing business crisis in Nigeria is why the theme, comes together. Collaboration for action, competitiveness, growth, and stability as sub-dynamics of that conversation.
A brilliant way to start. And you just spoke around that speech, that very illuminating speech, I must say, yesterday, taking us back down the lane and what has happened. But one key thing I was able to take out is from the Vice President of the World Bank is we must follow the course. And looking at our Nigerian factor, what do you think? Talking about 10 to 15 years before all of this crystallizes, where do we start from? What are the quick wins for government? They need to address the vulnerable ones.
Well, I think first we need to situate the Vice President of the World Bank speech properly.
Okay.
Number one is that because we did not do for over a decade what was necessary, right? We created a blotted subsidy that was corrupt, inefficient, that lacked transparency. That subsidy, blew up into an unsustainable size. When the budget was 11 trillion, subsidy was 7 trillion.
Yes.
A country cannot run like that. So I think that we got an unsustainable subsidy over many years of mismanagement. In the Obasanjo era, remember that because we got the debt relief gave us a new leaf, and we were in the boom, and so we created an excess crude surplus for years, and we paid for subsidy from surplus right up to 2010. In 2010, 36 governors of this federation took the federal government to court that they did not have a right to save for Nigeria. And we disbursed almost $50 billion worth of excess crude accounts in Nigeria. That depletion of the savings could remove the fiscal buffers in Nigeria. We achieved a BB plus economy in the last 30 years. Our reforms achieved a BB plus economy. We moved from BB plus to BB minus. When Fitch and Moody's downgraded the economy, and you can Google this, Nigerians that were not either born or young can Google this, our economy was downgraded from a BB plus to a BB minus, I think, because the fiscal buffers, and that's the reason that was given, the fiscal buffers that Nigeria had were depleted in this just giving subnationals money. Now, from 2011 to 2015, we then went into a first-line charge on revenue to support subsidy. And when oil dipped at $22 to the naira, right, we were selling crude oil per barrel at $15 some months during January 2016, which meant that we could not even discover the production costs. Of crude oil. And that, I think, created a huge problem. Okay? And I think that is what points to the fundamental things that need to shift in terms of how we do things. And those things need to fundamentally change the trajectory of how we behave in terms of what needs to move on. So, an unsustainable fiscal balance created by many years of cascading consequences of wrong choices got us to the unsustainable deficit. There was a point in 2022 where debt servicing to revenue crossed 123%.
Wow.
123%. In other words, for every dollar we made, we were spending $1.23 paying debts.
Yes.
Was not sustainable.
Not at all.
And then at the point of the election, we're spending over 90% of revenue to pay debt. You can't build any nation like that. Now, is this the fault of the citizens? No. Right? And so when the removal of fuel subsidy happened, I think the point that the senior vice president made was that it was inevitable. We needed to do it. And that kind of changed the dynamics of where fiscal decisions needed to go. Okay? And I think that two things are crucial in what needed to happen going out. The first is the need to basically manage the trajectory of fiscal discipline and fiscal decisions. And so closing that deficit was important. But by the way, if you have a deficit of 70 trillion and you close 25, you still have 50. You know, and that's just a hypothetical number. Yeah. But the idea is, the mere fact we closed the deficit on the subsidy did not close the deficit. It reduced the deficit. So when we say we saved money from subsidy, not completely accurate. We saved ourselves a larger deficit. There's still a lot it takes to solve the problem. So I do agree with the senior vice president, we need to steady the course. Yeah. But in steadying the course, two important political leadership characteristics are required.
Tell us.
The first is transparency. A government that is asking the citizens to embark on radically painful reforms has to show revenue transparency, expenditure transparency, liability transparency, asset transparency. Our biggest assets, NNPC, oil production, gas assets, have to become so transparent that we can account every day for every liter of crude or gas produced in Nigeria. Then we need to know where all our assets are and how they are doing and whether they are encumbered or not. Then we need to know the size of our liabilities. So, for example, government signed a lot of oil forward contracts for loans. True. What is the size of the forwards? How many years forward are we paying? How many barrels of crude a day do we need to produce to just pay our debts, talk less of run Nigeria? You need to create dramatic levels of transparency if you're asking citizens to tighten their belt. Then there has to be very deep expenditure transparency and efficiency and accountability. Citizens need to know that as they tighten their belt, that every dollar or naira of government is judiciously applied to the points of highest need and productivity. Once you do that with fiscal transparency or governance transparency, so fiscal accountability transparency, procurement transparency, budget transparency, disbursement transparency, even what we now say should go to the local governments. Local government transparency. We need to see local government budgets. Local government budget, again, local government development plans. We need to hold local governments accountable for the resources that go to them. Both expenditure transparency, contract transparency, action for results in terms of what gets to the people, value for money audits. When we begin to show those within the accountability and transparency architecture, then that first characteristics of our political leadership behavior will create the inspiration, the motivation for citizens to stay the course for longer, for 10 years, for 20 years, whatever it takes to get Nigeria right. Because at least all of us will say we are in it together. We are doing the hard work together. We are making the sacrifices together, and we're going to win together. So that's number one. Second political characteristic important to do what the vice president has said is reform capacity. Now, reform capacity has three parts. You have to have the right reform ethos. Ethos, where you get the word ethics. I don't care about your reform if you cannot be an example of your reform, right? So the government has to ensure that each reform is backed by the right credibility, capacity, capability, and trustworthiness. The character of the reform should show that the integrity of public leaders and governments that lead them are the examples of the reform and the change that they seek in citizens. Number two is reform, so the reform ethos. Right. The second is the reform pathos, which is the people want to know you feel what they feel. Pathos is the Greek word where you get empathy or empathetic. People don't care what you know till they know you care. You know, reformers and policymakers need to learn, to feel what people feel. And one of the evidences you're feeling what people feel is that you're listening. Empathy is about listening to people. It's about understanding people's pain. So the second part of reform capacity is that pathos, the sense that I am being listened to. That if I am in Damaturu or if I am in Aba, I'm heard by my government. That at local, at state, at federal, the Nigerians are heard, that their pains are felt. And that everything government is doing is modeling that they understand that pain and that they are responsive and sensitive to those pains. The last is reform logos. Reform logos is about the optics. You know, people want to see, hear that governments act consistently in the direction. So every time government speaks, they want to know, they want to hear that you understand their pain. They want to see a clear vision of where things need to go. You need to provide in a reform, complex reforms like ours, a clear economic plan that provides forward guidance to business, to investors, to citizens that, look, it's not enough to say, make some sacrifices. You need to say, this is the 5-year plan. The first 24 months will be painful. This is how we will deal with the pain. These are the incentives we will apply. Okay? The next 1 year will then be the consolidation phase, and then we will accelerate. And we are going to hold all ourselves accountable on a monthly, weekly, in a crisis like this. Look, when we were in the COVID crisis, the federal government of Nigeria was addressing Nigerians at 4 p.m. every day for 1 year. It wasn't that the federal government had all the answers to COVID, but that the citizens knew that the federal government will, at 4 p.m. every day, will give them a state of where COVID was. It wasn't like we had all the answers, but to the degree to which we were talking to people, listening to people, we survived COVID.
We did.
Now, if we are in an economic COVID, then what citizens want to see is a more calibrated governance model where they are briefed more regularly, where the policymakers are speaking to them monthly, where people are talking to them about policies before the policies are made, explaining why. And when the policies don't deliver the right output, that the policymakers are willing to sit with citizens, business firms, and discuss what's not working so that we course correct. That's what's missing. So the reform logos, reform pathos, reform ethos forms the capacity to drive reforms and transparency and accountability. So I think everything that, and by the way, this is important because the Asian countries, many of the countries have gone through this difficult pathway to difficult reforms, painful for citizens, also had credibility with the people, you know, where pro-poor policies and social protection policies work. You can't say you're disbursing 5 million money to 5 million households, and you can't show those 5 million households. You cannot say you're disbursing 75 billion to manufacturers, 1 billion to each manufacturing firm, and you cannot bring us a list of the 75 manufacturing firms. You can't do that in a crisis. So more transparency, more showing and telling. So for example, there's free bags of rice being given to vulnerable households. We are at the stage where you must actually do those distribution on live TV, right? And we see the Nigerians benefiting. And then the transparency, the pervasive accountability makes it hard to say that somebody stole something, because that's what everybody thinks. If you look at social media, yesterday, as soon as the senior vice president said, stir the cause, social media went on rampage. I was following all the channels, and citizens were angry, and they said, why is he saying this to us when you can't hold this government, or can't hold governments at federal, state, local accountable? So I think that those are the tough choices ahead of us. Steady the cause, but steady the cause whilst creating transformative levels of transparency and accountability in budgeting, planning, procurement, contracting, disbursements, and in money for value, money for results type outputs and accountability, and drive and expand reform capacity, build the credibility and the capacity and the capability of the institutions, build the empathy of the institutions to listen to citizens, and build the capacity of the institutions to communicate Policies in a clear way that provides, like I said, a well-sequenced set of forward guidance. Monetary policy, fiscal policy, trade policy, investment policy. And that together will allow us to move on the trajectory of stability, growth, and sustainability, and we can then collaborate because we all know where we are going together to get there.
I must thank you so much, Dr. Tayo Adeloju. It's been interesting talking to you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much.
Have a great deliberation as it's been on all the while. Thank you so much.
Thank you.